So good evening, everyone, and thanks Paroma and Deepika for putting this evening and this conversation together. I should add a little more context to how I came into the picture. There is more sort of work and project between Tata Trusts, AKTC. Uh, it was also Deepika and my conversation when the IIM issue sort of first came up a few years ago. And we both sort of had a long conversation after I had a long piece because it was Net Journal published. They did a really long 3,000 word kind of a piece on how do you look at the IIM issue. The discussions that happened between us, that the issues of heritage, the issues of conservation, the issues of history are much more murkier and much more complicated than sort of simply saying this is what we should do and this is what we should not do. So in a sense that where she was talking from the perspective of projects, where somebody was trying to sort of put a sense of history and heritage in conversation with each other, partly as an academic, partly as a writer, but partly who's always also engaged with history, at least the 19th and the 20th century, much more actively, that as much as one will have to constantly differentiate between nostalgia, need, necessity, politics of the place, and the way sort of directions are moving. So there was a larger sense of how we sort of perceive the practice of heritage, perceive the discourse around heritage and history. And in that sense, these books were, I think, in the process at that point in time. And we actually had one round of conversation, the two of us, which is still accessible and available online. And I would like to sort of mention that, because in a sense, today's conversation in a way will also be a kind of a recall of some of those questions, but also leading to sort of new questions or other discussions between the two of us, and the many shared practices that all of us have. One is to sort of congratulate the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and the Tata Trust for putting these set of volumes together. There may be many questions on how these volumes, or how a text or how a document like this functions. What does it mean to put a set of practice guidelines together? What does it mean to sort of put a manual of rate references together? Things are going to change. Things are changing faster than we ever thought before. That's always going to be the scene. But how do you still put a certain kind of a benchmark, a certain kind of a datum from which you sort of even can say that this datum is not fair enough and you need to put another datum together. So in that sense, this task is very, very important. One can have many approaches and many views to it, but I think the task is very, very important. And maybe, Ratish, we could begin by sort of hearing from you what it means after so many years of practice to put this kind of a document together. What does it mean for the larger profession? But what does it mean also from your experience of where conservation practice, I think there's a longer history to conservation practice when you look at archaeology, when you look at national monuments, but there's also a shorter history of conservation in the way urban conservation has developed since the 1990s, and there's a very active practice where conservation is with buildings that are in active use, conservation is active with buildings that are monuments, but they are also monuments in the public space in that sense, and communities, people are connected, sometimes more through memory, but sometimes also through everyday use of living inside and around those monuments. So where do you sort of see this kind of a task in this broader history of conservation in India?
Thanks. Well, thank you, Deepika. I think this, at some point we were sort of pulling our hair out, saying, what the hell have we committed to doing? But very glad it's now out there in the public domain. We in India pride ourselves as a ancient civilization, and yet when you look at it, there is less than 10,000 buildings which are protected in India for their heritage value. That's about 1/3 the number of heritage buildings protected by law in New York City alone. And unfortunately, 75 years after independence, we have sort of totally disregarded the conservation I would say, industry as compared to the construction industry. Now in the UK, 55% of construction industry budget goes into conservation of historic buildings. And over here, it probably is 0.000, 20 more zeros, 5%. And I think, and what's been the result of that is that our heritage is seriously at risk. Personally, I think what has catalyzed that risk is that conservation is seen as some sort of a nuclear science which only nuclear scientists can discuss or talk about. Now, this is a far cry from what we were about 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, those guys were king, you know. They didn't need architects or engineers. They would be directly hired by the emperor or the nawab or whoever is doing it. And they knew, I mean, that building at the back was not done by architects and engineers, it was done by craftsmen. That over 100 years has changed dramatically. So what's happened is these guys are now redundant. They're like master craftsmen. 75-year-old will stand with his hands folded saying, "Saab, aap jaise bolenge, hum kar denge." And the architect and the engineer have become king of the construction conservation world. The problem is the architect and the engineer doesn't understand that material. They don't understand the centuries of building traditions, building techniques, and building materials. As a result, none of our cities are spared. None of our buildings are spared. So for us, this, many years ago, Deepika asked me to look at some of the other projects that the Tata Trusts were funding. And from there onwards, we started to say, why is there so much of difference in rates, in specifications, in how conservation is done by different agencies? And got us so this is really a result of about 20 years of our material that is now being put in the public domain. As Deepika mentioned, we made a lot of effort to get as much material from the Archaeological Survey of India, other agencies, to really try to make conservation, make people who are not specialists to understand conservation, and to aid the conservation professionals and standardize some of this. So it's, this is ideally equivalent or included within the CPWD schedule of rates. That's where it should live. It should have been done 75 years ago when we got independence. Because, we're talking about incredible India, we're talking about make in India, we're talking about all of those right things, we're talking about sustainability. These are all local materials, local practices. And for me to, be here today and talk about this is both with a sense of relief, but also with the hope and the understanding that this would make conservation practice accessible to bureaucrats, donors, decision makers, architects, engineers, owners of historic building, and so on. So, and it's on their website, so it's easily accessible and so on.
Thanks, Ratish. Ratish, whether it's an ASI monument or some of the work that AKTC has done, or it is a couple of buildings in, say, Fort area in Bombay, all of them have always had stakeholders, users, professionals and craftsmen, as you sort of pointed out right now. And there's always this constant debate between the conceptual or the kind of thematic or so let's say the political approaches to conservation, whichever scale of monument or heritage we are talking about. And at the same time, there is the practicalities of putting a building once again together, making it accessible either as a monument or as a usable structure. So where does the professional expertise or a document like this handle itself or put itself in between?
I think there has been various discussions amongst we've engaged with many professionals on this during it, before it, after it, and for me it's been rare to see so much of agreement, unanimity, that okay, this is an important thing. So it's been quite good how so many people stepped up and sort of said this is what we need. Now, a conservation architect or a conservation agency such as ourselves would typically spend weeks trying to work this out before starting a conservation project. And after doing that for weeks, a donor or a bureaucrat or even internally within the Archaeological Survey of India, it would be questioned saying, on what basis has this been done? So in that sense, we stepped out from the usual DSR by making it more illustrative, by including drawings, by doing all of that. There have been people saying, oh, this will encourage non-conservation professionals to start doing conservation. Now, that's not going to happen to the Taj Mahal hotel or monument, but where they will always need professionals, because you need to, what you're saying, you need to, what you said in terms of conceptual, that this doesn't tell you what is the right way to fix a building.
Right.
It tells you, once you've figured out that, okay, this wall is going to be left like this ruinous wall because we want to see all those arches and all of that, then it tells you how to make sure it keeps standing, what is the amount of pointing that needs to go in, what should be the composition of that, and what it will cost. Now, for doing this, where we did not have enough expertise, then we actually commissioned that work. For example, if we didn't have a certain kind of wall with a certain kind of lime mortar or whatever, we actually commissioned it, timed it, and as a result, we figured out how many craftsmen will be employed, what will it cost. And so I think it's not what it tries to do is it tries to aid the conservation effort. It cannot do the conservation for you or whatever, but it does try to aid the conservation professional or a heritage building owner to figure out what it is. But in the long run, everything in India takes time. So maybe in a 5-10 years from now, what it will also do is bring some sort of confidence in bureaucrats, donors, to sort of say, okay, this is kosher. For example, I don't know whether any of you know about this Ministry of Tourism grant called Swadesh Darshan Grant. Now, Swadesh Darshan Grant is really given to heritage sites. And yet, they don't permit you to do any conservation with that money. You can build toilets, you can build pathways, you can do all sorts of things, but you cannot do conservation. So at the Qutub Shahi tombs, we actually have a Swadesh Darshan Grant, and we're doing a new museum with it. But at the Pega tombs, also they said no conservation. Just because no bureaucrat wants to sort of get into something where the person is going to be challenged on rates or on quality of work. I think that, even if it sort of automatically gets people in decision-making positions to sort of say, okay, I've got this, and we have something to go on.
So the possibility is to sort of, is that it may open up the familiarity and the comfort with dealing with conservation projects on one hand for bureaucrats, etc., that you mentioned. The other
nuclear science
anymore. The other option is that if somebody has a smaller structure, smaller building, which otherwise would have been too much of an effort, it's possible to sort of start with this and somebody else doing the project with basic knowledge, basic information. Because I think also in the field, I think the other question that is now emerging, at one hand, one has that agencies, larger institutional structures, whether it is the AKTC or say, again, an entity like the Tata Trust that comes in not just with funding, but with a certain kind of a vision. But there are also individuals, besides INTAC, all of those things, there are also individuals who are doing individual buildings, individual owners, etc. It will also require that there is some kind of understanding of what is the professional expertise, what is the capacity building, how far can the capacity building go on, and how will that be worked out besides a couple of the academic programs in conservation architecture that are running as master's programs in school. Because at some point it will also have to diversify beyond the expert in some way. The experts will always be required. One is saying no, as you mentioned, but to sort of diversify that, whether an architect or an engineer or a craftsperson kind of a working collective, they all have some kind of capacity building to handle situations, because the situations are multiple and many that we see always around us. So any thoughts on this, institutions, individuals, etc.?
You see, your question brings me back to my earlier point that, how much has changed, till a generation ago, we were still making traditional materials in every village. That elderly white-haired gentleman in a black coat sitting there, your time you would still be making the tuna, right, Anupam? But now it's become, it's really conservation for dummies. And it's really putting together in a readable format. And what we've done is we've looked at every material, and we're looking at a Delhi region, which means central, from not the specialist regions like the Himalayas or Gujarat or Northeast, where this individual that you talk about, and if an individual is a slight amount of initiative, I think would be able to say, okay, I don't need 20 people's opinion on what to mix with my lime, how much I have to grind it. It's all there. It's ratified and it's tested. The rates are available. Method is available. Go and fix your granddad's house. The number of calls I as a conservation professional get from people saying, this is my house in Allahabad and, I want to do something to it, and I said, send me pictures, and the house looking absolutely fine. And there's one little patch of damp. I was like, really, seriously, don't worry. But it's really become, what us conservationists have been able to do is convince everybody that only we know how to do this. And now we're taking full circle and we're going back to them and saying, this is what we know. So whether you're an institution, I think the potential is limitless. I agree with those people on the other side of the spectrum who's saying, don't put this out there because everybody will think you're a conservation architect. So that will happen. God forbid one of those people is allowed to build or to work on the Taj Mahal, again, hotel or monument. But if somebody's going to experiment with their own house and go slightly wrong, I think the benefits far outweigh the risk. And as to, for us at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, it's been an absolute, I don't know what word to use, but privilege, encouraging to have this partnership with the Tata Trust, first at Humayun's tomb, then at the Qutub Shahi tombs. And these are two iconic conservation projects in the public domain. And for us as institutions, I think we were morally and duty bound to put our learnings in the public domain.
Yes.
So, um, and I think it will. I mean, for anybody intelligent, whether you're an architect, engineer, or anybody who's involved with building, even contractors, if you're an intelligent person, you're going to, and if 20 contractors figure out how to do it, I think the crazy costs that some government institutions are paying for conservation will come down.
No, I think that's very, very important that as trusts, as foundations, there is a certain sense of the public responsibility. There is also a certain sense of the professional responsibility. And what do the learnings sort of turn into, shape into is quite important. Let's, a little bit of the shift of gear, but you know, two long-running projects. One is the Humayun's Tomb project. The other is the Nizamuddin area project. These have been long-running projects. What have you observed as somebody who's not only been closely working with it, but also at sometimes you possibly had the maybe I can say the luxury of standing back and seeing over a period of time what has happened. What have been the shifts in the way projects have grown in the last decades, in the last few decades, in terms of approach, in terms of public engagement, in terms of people, in terms of governmental approaches or that kind of responsibility, public responsibility? What have been the broader areas that heritage also, or the conversation around heritage also needs to focus on, also needs to think actively on? Because that was, I think, one concern that Deepika and myself had. How are we shaping our discourse? Because at least conservation is clearly one area where the discourse and the practice cannot be separated. And we've seen that very actively debated in some of the recent cases.
There are far too many young people sitting here, so I don't want to be a cynic. I think, having done this sort of thing for 25 plus years now, I think personally I'm sort of quite disappointed at the absolute lack of debate, absolute lack of, a sense of urgency about a heritage. I think, I think partly us conservationists are to blame because we've made it so, made it so much. Everything is wrong, and what is right is not explained. So, again, 25 years after we started at Humayun's Tomb, we remain the only private agency working on national monuments anywhere in the country. And if anything, the Archaeological Survey of India has become more sort of determined to keep it that way. And so the liberalization that all of us have experienced in every sector of life in India has not touched the heritage sector. It's still government responsibility. Having said that, and so that all these young people don't lose hope, I think things are changing. The government of India, about a couple of years, announced this Adopt a Heritage scheme in the Ministry of Tourism. It has now come into the Ministry of Culture and the ASI. Unfortunately, it's still limited to building toilets and CCTV cameras, but how long can they limit it to that? Telangana has been incredible. We've done a lot of work together at the Kuli Qutub Shah tombs. And I think it's mind-boggling that within 1 year of, the Baulis, we fixed 6 Baulis last year. And when we started at the Qutub Shahi tombs, we were buying water in tankers. So you can imagine what the cost is. 100 monuments, you have to do 100 acres, you have to plant, and you're buying water in tankers, 2 rupees per liter. So to fix that, we found these Baulis, we fixed, and 21 million liters of water last 2 years, of rainwater. that itself becomes 40 million rupees, which is much more than the Bauli's conservation cost. But the government of Telangana has immediately caught on to that, and now there are MOUs after MOUs to fix Bauli. They're talking about 100 Baulis within a year. So I think nothing succeeds better than success. I think I think that is very encouraging. Um, um, and so what the volumes will do is, I strongly believe it will get down the conservation rates from planet Mars or Jupiter or wherever they are to planet Earth. And that itself would encourage donors, it would encourage government, it would encourage private entrepreneurship. And I think it's you won't probably see it for another 10, 20 years till all of these people start picking it up and saying, what the hell is this? But what it'll do is it'll bridge the craftsmen and the architects. It's teaching architects how to use craftsmen. And in that process, we've got some films also which the Tata Trust separately did, which tell you how to make lime. And those things are all provided in the manual, how to do stone carving. So there are films that go with this, and maybe those should also separately be on your website. But so it's a real sincere attempt at try to fill that gap which you're talking about. Despite all of this work, with the use of the internet, with the use of forums such as this, to sort of put it in the public domain. And once we sort of put this and given it to every SI circle, people will use it just to save themselves some time and money, and then it'll become a habit.
Just to move on to two areas. One is an area that I mentioned earlier also, but I would like you to sort of speak a little bit about it. Was working with Nizamuddin, which was kind of active, people, engaging with people. So one was engaging with materiality that was of a very different nature. What was that experience?
I think in India, if you're doing conservation, you need to, I think in Mr. A.G.K. Menon's words, he wrote something in the 1980s. I read it. It had a profound impact on me as a student. And in India, you can't really be focused on what we were.
Right.
I think you need to focus on what we are becoming. And conservation has to be part of that solution.
Right.
So for us at Nizamuddin, the year after we finished Humayun's tomb garden restoration, about a month or so after, the imam of the mosque in the Dargah. So there's a 14th century mosque in the Dargah, in the Nizamuddin Dargah. And the imam or his brother came to me and said, can you fix this mosque? It's unprotected. And I was like, what the hell is this about? Is this really happening? And he said, we've seen what you've done at Humayun's tomb. And you are our only hope. And I didn't know what was the truth, what was happening. So I waited till my boss was over from Geneva and I said, let's have the meeting now. By then they had actually written to us. It's taken us 5 years. We fixed that mosque. In fact, yesterday the final calligraphy was being put back. And we've removed layers and layers of paint. So a lot of people hate us because it's no longer this purple and golden thing. It's really red sandstone. But, if you had asked me this question that you're asking me, Kaiwan, 5 years ago, and said, what is your reach? And this is a community that has benefited from health, education, sanitation, everything we've done. So even for that community, it's important for us to put this out there. so that they will not paint this with this lead paints anymore. They will, and the community is bitterly divided over this conservation. But I would like to say 60% of them are immensely grateful and, you know, been incredible partners. We've had to stop the work for Eid, Ramzan, you know, so we work about 100 days in a year, and it's very frustrating for our engineers. And the other 40%, and sadly it's more the young people in the community say, Bhadda kar diya, itna sundar tha, because we've taken off all the garish colors which are not part of the building anymore. But what something like that does is tells you that if you paint it, you're sort of.
But this also makes me feel that in many ways, conservation efforts are also civic efforts. In that sense, you are sort of building a civic public together. I think that's also been the experience in Bombay.
Conservation needs to come back to the mainstream. Which
Yes, 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 yes. So in a sense, rather than being a niche practice, that's what I'm saying, that, you know, practically in a city like Bombay, which I'm more familiar with to sort of speak easy, that practically most of the repair work will fall in conservation if you sort of open up the lens of conservation, and the renovations or the repairs will be done much better than the way they are being carried out right now. And in that sense, it's a much two things, much broader sense of how you build a civic, how you build a public kind of a space, or how do you build a sense of public around or using the built heritage or the built landscape that we already have. But the other thing is also a certain sense of responsibility, also a certain sense of thoughtfulness that comes even when one has been at Humayun, I think at different stages. And I think whether it is tourists or whether it has been sort of layers of different people working over a long time, it has also actually, even a monument has built a range of conversations, whether or whether it's tourists, as to how do you see a structure in your midst. And I think this I would like to sort of extend this to and hear you more on what are your views, or what are you thinking when one is sort of listening to debates around what we have now started calling modern heritage. So I think the IIM case has been sort of one of the most loudly discussed one. But there have been many ones, the Charles Correa building in Goa, a couple of others, whereas at the same time, a lot of living architects have also said, including seniors, like whether it was Charles, not living any longer, but Charles Correa, Kamu Iyer, all of them saying that, you know, we've seen our buildings sort of disappear. Some of them are being reconstructed as samples inside campuses. One case I know with respect to SEPT. But the other one has been this sort of debate as to what do you look at. There were different pressures in the case of IIM, engineering, construction at that point in time. It's not surviving. How do you handle a project like that? Where do you think these conversations are going from your experience?
How many conservation architects in this room?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so if I get stones thrown at me, there'll be only 6 or 7. You see, what we don't realize is that more than anything else, there is no one right way to do conservation. And what this manual doesn't really go into the conservation philosophy, because there's enough out there. There is enough in terms of Bara Charter. All over the world, last 100 years, there is so much philosophy. Talking about philosophy, the Archaeological Survey of India in 1926 writes that John Marshall, the DG, that actually the whole line is, since funds will necessarily be limited, preservation should be done and repair attempted only when special funds are available. Unfortunately, for 100 years, the ASI never went out and sought special funds like we came to the Tata Trust for the Humayun's tomb. So that is 1926. Now, by the 1970s, 80s, the Bara Charter, the Australia ICOMOS Bara Charter is saying preservation is to be attempted only where no other conservation intervention is possible. Which means, kaam chori mat karo. You know, in Hindi, you know, it's basically what it is. So, that is the breadth of it. So now when you go to the IIM, essentially, out, when you start any building, us conservation architects actually say, okay, what is it we're trying to do? Are we, and then when you start doing that, you say, what is the significance of this building? For example, at Humayun's Tomb, we said the outstanding universal value includes the fact that Humayun's Tomb is part of an ensemble of 16th century garden tombs. So for us to fix 16th century garden tombs all across was equally important. At the Qutub Shahi tombs, we're saying it's a unique ensemble. It's an ensemble, not individual, ensemble. So we're doing all 100 monuments. So when you actually do that, then IIM doesn't happen, because nobody's saying it's not your way or the highway. There is a compromise. There has to be a compromise. To sort of say, okay, one building is leaking and to fix it will take 30 crores and I will knock it all down, is wrong. A, that building shouldn't cost 30 crores. And B, if money is an issue, there are 10 other ways to fix. I mean, look at this building in front of you. There are 10 other ways to fix it. So, unfortunately, all of these decisions of knocking down IIM or to making changes to Charles Correa's buildings are not conservation or architecture or design. These are, I know this is being recorded, so I won't say what I want to say. But yeah, I mean, there is absolutely no justification for this sort of mindless vandalism, you know.
Yeah. No, mindless vandalism, but I think, for example, just to...
No building is beyond conservation. I mean, and it's always a compromise. Sometimes you say, okay, we will hold this up one way or the other. Or, fine, we want to keep this much of it, or we will put a reuse to this one. There is, in my opinion, I have not come across any building that is beyond conservation. Now, conservation starts at preservation, goes on to reconstruction. At the most, in some building, you'll say, okay, we'll only preserve what is there. We'll only preserve, keep it that. But to sort of say this building cannot be preserved and we must knock it down, Osmania General Hospital in Hyderabad, that debate's been going on forever. It'll take nothing to conserve. But we have to be flexible. It's a hospital building. It needs adaptive use. It'll need some compromise. And that's where, you know, we all sort of stand our positions. And
no, so as much as one agrees, absolutely, without any reservations, one agrees. But I also had a problem with the debate on the other side, which was super and hyper emotional, whether it was Curtis or the Ahmedabad bunch of architects, where in fact, one of the points that I argued was that rather than doing this high-pitch argument, you have B.V. Doshi's office there that worked on that building, you have the engineer there. The possibility was to say that, okay, let's put a manual like this together. In fact, even before I knew in detail that this manual was, that was one of the things that these were also constructed in times that were very sort of developing times for a nation like India. So many things were done by young architects, young engineers. So the ideas were strong and iconic, but a lot of the experiences were young. So these buildings will require a certain kind of a thinking. And one of the simplest things is to say that you know what went into the making of that building and how do you repair, renovate, and upkeep such buildings have to be produced. So rather than that high-pitched voice, those architects could have come forward to say, let's put a manual or let's have that kind of a conversation together.
so you hit the nail on the head. You said the IIM is representative of a new freedom, a new time, young architects, this, that. So what is it that the IIM represents? It represents innovative use of material and design. And there is no way that those two elements cannot be easily conserved, preserved for the future. In a worst case scenario, when the concrete is all gone, for heaven's sake, relay it. It doesn't take crores of rupees to relay concrete. But to have a developer mindset and sort of unsustainable mindset, because you're talking about today sustainability. You're talking about the sustainable development goals. We're trying to fulfill the sustainable development goals through conservation projects. I think there is enough material out there to be able to say without doubt that we have the means, technical, financial, to protect these heritage buildings. And whatever debate is presented, on the contrary, is not conservation, that's just politics.
Yes, yes.
Unfortunately, a manual like that doesn't, is not something that is, that cannot deal with the politics of it. But I think we need to realize that every historic building has value, which is also economic.
Yes.
And just like we wouldn't just throw out an aging parent, we need to invest in a historic building, but not only emotional. Because, for example, at Humayun's tomb, I've given you the example of the Baolis. Now, which other business or any business has that rate of return? I mean, by fixing 6 Baolis in whatever, say 4, 5 crores or whatever, 3 crores, you're talking about 1 year's water collection is more than that much money. Just in terms of real terms. 1 year. So where is, and at Humayun's tomb, you talked about international visitors. We made the mistake of sort of very proudly saying that, we got 6 crores from the Tata Trust, we put in our 4 crores, and we did 10 crores garden restoration. And the visitor number increased 1,000%. So the ASI earned that 10 crores in less than a year in excess ticket sales. Now, and it's sustainable, and that was, 25 years ago, and it goes on every year, producing the same amount of money. So in the sense, what we're trying to do here in India, both at Delhi and Hyderabad, saying, look, this is another way to do it.
No, I think maybe I should mention it's been a pet project for me, not just for conservation, but for some other practices, and I've discussed both with Deepika and with you. I think parallel to this, for some of the other things that you kept saying that, this manual cannot do that, but this is doing what it is supposed to do in this direction. I think it's a question that in the last few years, even we as a profession, just architecture, built environment as a profession, we've also not put together simply case study practices or case studies of practices in the way things have happened. Because I think right from people to political will to the practicalities of a job, there have been many experiments that have happened, whether it's conservation or whether it's other kind of public projects. And I think this is a kind of a cumulative knowledge again, that partly in the academic space, partly in the research space, but I think partly also in the public foundation space needs to be put together.
I agree.
Well, on that note, maybe we can sort of open it up for a few questions from the audience.
But I think also it cannot be done by individuals. It had to have the Tata Trust.
No, sure, yes,
So
yes. No, because it will be sort of cumulative. So again, that's why I mentioned the academic space, because I think, and as an academic space, I think today we look at academic spaces, university spaces, as a far bigger responsibility than sort of turning out 80 students who can do X, Y, Z.
That's how it should be. Yeah.
So I think the responsibility of knowledge accumulation and building knowledges towards sort of future practices is the responsibility of universities equally. Yeah. I think there was a hand there.
Hi. Hello. Hi, my name is Rahul Kirur. I had a question. So,
Hold it a bit closely like this.
is that better? Yeah, definitely. Okay. So, heritage monuments conservation, public works conservation, and local and private conservation. These are, I feel like, three distinct facets where money and resources are either given or are available for public works or for conservation preservation. So this manual that you've put together is a resource for all these initiatives. How would you suggest a growing or a new architectural studio to get into conservation? Because it seems like a pretty daunting task for anybody to get into.
Well, he should be answering that, but I'll make an attempt at this one. I think partly the question that he kept hinting at the first part of the conversation was precisely that there is a space for expertise, and a certain kind of a master's training program is essential today. One is not discounting that. But at the same time, I think the fact what he sort of mentioned is the transition from craftsman-oriented construction, repair as a natural process to sort of also I think what happens, and I think this is something we've been speaking even in other forums, that we constantly talk of the architect's job as constructing from scratch to new. But what happens post the new? The life of a building is something like repair and building health management is something that the architecture profession just doesn't seem to take as a professional responsibility, and that's left to the contractors, and then you curse the contractors and the repair guys. So I think there is that opening up of that space, and again with conservation it would come with that specific mention that he spoke about engineers, architects, craftsmen, etc. working together. And I think the possibility that there are scales of projects, and I think there would be scales of project that today, as an editor of a magazine, one came across so many projects where everybody was doing like 10% of conservation work or 10% of contextual work in some kind of a serious heritage, less heritage kind of a context all the time. And in that sense, I think one is a public sphere debate or a case studies book would be useful for anybody. But on the other hand, a manual like this sort of gives you the starting point that if you had a house that you were working with, a kind of a semi-palace, a small bungalow that you were working with, you could at least begin at your basic professional knowledge without sort of waiting for expert knowledge, because at all points you may not need expert knowledge in that sense. So that would be my sort of reply. Yeah.
Also, what it does is, architecture schools usually don't give you that amount of material knowledge. So if you got stone or brick or tile or wood or lime, what we've tried to do here is, really break it down and make young architects realize that it's no different from using cement. I mean, unfortunately, all the training that we're now getting is in cement and glass, steel. So it's really a stepping back into other material sciences.
My question. Okay. So my question is not about conservation, but what about the mistakes that the architect might have made? Is there a manual that records those? Because it really, as an architect, I've lived through a Charles Correa building which has mistakes in it. And it's a model for low-cost housing. And I was just wondering how architects would like to not only repair, but take these points in mind and have a policy for at least, put a sellotape on it till it's brought down or something.
I'm saying I'm not defending Charles Correa, but I'm saying it all depends on what you think is a mistake or not a mistake, or you're comfortable or you're not comfortable. And I think that's going to be part and parcel of any building. Maybe in a more technical way, if I'm to transfer your question to a more technical thing, that maybe when you're sort of opening up a building like this, you realize that, like partly in IIM's case, I know of certain situations where for certain reasons there are mistakes, what you could technically call a mistake in the construction of a waterproofing situation, etc. So those could be, how could they be approached or corrected? Huh? No, but now design mistakes, my teacher and somebody who's worked with Charles Correa is sitting there. So what is a design mistake? I think we'll leave it at that.
I think what we're trying to do is make sure you don't do conservation mistakes.
Yes.
So my question is to Ratish. I hope I can be heard.
Just a little close.
Like this?
Yes, better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So some years back, I had the privilege of reviewing the book on the Humayun's tomb. The experience, it was given to me by LA Journal. Geeta sent it to me. And I actually went forward thinking of Professor Shahid's work, being his student. But I came back with a feeling of, joy that the community had been involved. So I'd really like to know whether this landmark project also resulted in the ASI, looking at the community as being a part of the process. Was that possible?
Well, after the recording is over, we'll have a conversation.
Sure.
I think, the thing is, the Archaeological Survey of India employs archaeologists, engineers, 1 or 2 architects, historians, none of whom are really able to engage with communities. So what the project has really tried to demonstrate is not, I'm talking about the whole Nizamuddin urban project, it demonstrate many things apart from conservation. One of which was that it requires an interdisciplinary team to do some of this. So I have had the pleasure of working alongside people who really know how to work with communities, people who are specialists in health or education or sanitation or urban planning and things like that. So one of the things that we've tried to demonstrate is a large project like that, which is much outside today's discussion scope, cannot be done by the government alone. You need civil society organizations, you need academic groups, you need donors, you need all of that. I don't think anybody in the ASI will say that we don't want to benefit people. But they just have so much on their plate already that for them to do anything more will only be done if you get a whole, it's a decision higher than the ASI. It comes from the government.
I think with Nizamuddin, I think what was serendipitous was that if the Tata Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture work in all these areas. They work in conservation, they work in health, in education. So in that sense, it was a matching of 2 institutions, because I think our health portfolio, our education portfolio all worked, and I mean, there was support for that. And I think that I don't think people realized then, but it was a good matching of institutions.
So yes, so even in Nizamuddin, we did get a grant from then the Sir Ratan Tata Trust for an education, community education program. We had an incredible grant from the health portfolio of the Sir Dorabji Tata Trust on a community health program. So the local population is 20,000. We said, okay, health-seeking behavior is low. Let's provide a polyclinic. Let's provide all of that. We did. And then we realized over the last 10 years, 750,000 people had come to the polyclinic. Now, for a population, so people were coming from across northern India. but the community itself was not going to it. So then we had, as a result of that, we had a community health program, the first urban community health program anywhere in India, with this Dorabji Tata Trust at the Nizamuddin thing. But that's for another day. You know, Deepika, you have to call me back.
This model is important because it may have happened in a sense of by chance or serendipitous that these foundations, trusts were organized. But it's also something that what I meant when I said that it becomes a larger civic project. That also the possibility to look at certain projects as civic projects rather than only as built heritage projects. And I think then the outlook and the question also probably changes. One question there and...
So now I think I'll be
three questions,
okay.
1, 2 and 3, and then we close.
Okay, I just want to know how thick or thin is the line between preservation and conservation?
No, there's no line because conservation is the over and cup. So it's conservation is, so medicine, just the whole practice of medicine, and Dr. Deepika Saurabhji is sitting here. Now what will happen is, I have a slight cough and I'm trying to sort of have a lot of hot water and let it go. And that would really be equal to preservation. You're sort of saying, okay, the building is there, it's in this condition, just don't do anything, just make sure it doesn't fall further. So conservation is the whole discipline, and there are different levels of intervention. The basic level of intervention is preservation. And then there is the other extreme where you say, oh, this whole minaret has fallen down, but we have the evidence of what it looked like. So we are reconstructing. So when the Bara Charter says that preservation is only applicable when no other intervention is possible, that's when you don't have the evidence. So preservation is the basic, reconstruction is the other end. There are also other things like adaptive reuse. We don't have ice being made here, but the building is standing, it's an adaptive reuse. So those are the, and unfortunately there has been a lot of nonsense in India about we have to do only preservation. And in 2020, UNESCO gave us 2 awards for some of the work we did in Sundar Nursery. And for me, that's very important because UNESCO is saying in the certificate, saying reconstruction, this has changed the benchmark, these projects, and shown how reconstruction is equally valid. So I equate preservation with kamchori. That's what it is. It's like, I don't want to do any work, standing, when it falls, we'll talk about it, let it stand.
Asad, you had a question? Yeah, I thought you raised hand. Okay. So 2 and, yeah, 1 next.
So, hello, my name is Adil Dholakia. Thank you so much first for having this forum. My question comes out in direction of what this manual actually stands for. I just briefly browsed through it, and of course it's not something that is done, sorry? It's not something that is being done for the first time. Of course, in Germany also they have certain similar manuals. So while formulating this, were similar references being taken, because they also have a manual for restoration, reconstruction, conservation, of course, as a whole. So when these manuals were being made, were certain references being taken, or it's something only out of the practice that Tata Trust and EKTC does as a whole?
I think what you're referring to, there are 2 different things. Conservation is governed by 2 different things. One is philosophy, and that is transferable. So a conservation philosophy such as the Australia Bara Charter, which to me is brilliant, it's been 40 years, is valid not only in Australia but the whole world. But what we're doing here is only valid for the Indian conditions. These are material. We are basically trying to talk, a lot of this material is specific to India. Sandstone, yes, you find it in Scotland and all of that, but the way it is worked, the way it is used, this is very contextual to India. So what we're saying is, and if you're talking about references, see, this is a manual. It's got rates, it's got specifications, it's got analysis of rates. But as you know, rates change. So for us, when I say us, both Tata Trust and ourselves, we were continuously asking, where is the future of this manual? Because we can't do this every year. So for us, what was absolutely critical is to believe that this is going to be part of the Central Public Work Department's schedule of rates. And that is going to be its ultimate home. And the CPWD has a whole wing which upgrades its DSR every year. So what we've tried to do here is follow not any other model, but follow the CPWD DSR in terms of format, in terms of analysis. The other thing what it does is, it teaches you how to figure out something, which is not taught. You know, this is years of experience and so on. So if there is no material, and if there is no mention of a certain material that you're looking for, but if you have some initiative, this tells you how to work those rates out in terms of, the pattern can be done 20 times over. We also hope, and that is the next step, is to somehow figure out an app or something that it's all fed into and it automatically revises the rates at a touch of a button. But all of those things will follow.
Sir, my question is very similar to this fellow. So he was asking, what is not in the book?
What is not in the book?
What is that you wrote? I mean, for example, we have seen the picture of scaffolding. Just an example like that. So, scaffolding.
Yeah.
It's not in the book now. It may not be in the book.
It is in the book.
To understand this context.
Yeah. No, so what the book does is it provides any practitioner hints and often specific examples on how to use a material and what the use of that material is going to cost. So that is what is in the book. The philosophy is not in the book. I would have loved to put it in, but then we'll be reinventing the wheel because the philosophy is out there already. What is also not in the book, because we're talking about really historic buildings, is there is hell of a lot of research, for example, now on concrete. It's been done in France, it's been done, all of that is, so we've provided links. So in the book, we have provided links to studies or reports of the government which can be followed to justify some of this. So there are lots and lots of links to Indian standards, to building standards, to all of that. So, if somebody spends 6 months doing nothing but looking at this book, I think you should give them a certificate of some sort of, But yeah, all of that. So it was very fortunate that, to be doing this because one was able to get together so many people, both internally and also experts who really looked at it. There was, our team itself had a lot of engineers. There was Rajpal Singh, there was Mr. Bhandari, there were architects, there was Bhavna who did a lot of the work, there was Ujjwala, there were 20 other people. But then in terms of external expertise, we had Benny Koryakos from Chennai who really added a lot of value. And of course, Mr. Khurana, whom Deepika has mentioned. So, but there were also people such as Shahir Associates who were Yogesh from there who looked at the landscape thing. So when we first wrote out a proposal we did only this much. But then we said, okay, we could also do landscape. We've also done tile, so we could include all of that. So the hunger was really to put it all in the public domain. So that is what it was.
On that note, Paroma and Ratish, thank you. As always, wonderful, wonderful talking with you. Thank you so much.